It was a place the time seemed to forget. Out there, in the quiet rolling hills of Rappahannock County, Virginia. The year was 1929. The world was on the edge of a great collapse, but in these parts, life moved at its own slow, steady pace. And perched on a ridge, overlooking the Sleepy Hollows, stood Greylock Estate. It wasn't just a house. No, it was more than that. It was a monument to secrets. Its tall, dark windows looked like eyes, watching the seasons change, watching the people come and go. Or, in Greylock's case, watching them leave. The locals? They had their own name for it, the house on the hill. But they said it with a shiver. The estate spread across nearly 200 acres of untamed Virginia wilderness. Thick forests of oak and pine crowded its borders, their branches reaching toward the house like skeletal fingers. A long, winding dirt road, barely wide enough for a single motor car, was the only way in or out. And in the winter of 1929, that road was often a treacherous path of mud and ice. The house itself was a stark gray stone structure. It had been built to last, a fortress against the elements. But inside its walls, something else had taken root. A feeling. An atmosphere so heavy, you could almost taste it. A coldness that had nothing to do with the winter winds howling outside. The air around Greylock was different. That's what people said. Still. Silent. Even the birds seemed to sing a little quieter as they passed over the property line. The gardens, once meticulously cared for, were now a chaotic tangle of weeds and thorns. A stone bird bath, green with moss, sat empty and cracked. It was a picture of neglect, a portrait of abandonment. But it wasn't just forgotten, it was avoided. For years, no one had dared to disturb its slumber. The stories were just too strong, too persistent. Stories of a place that didn't want to be disturbed. A place that held on to its past with a cold, unyielding grip. And so, Greylock waited. It stood there, a silent sentinel against the pale winter sky. Its stone walls had seen so much, laughter maybe, but also sorrow, and something else, something darker, the kind of thing that seeps into the wood and stone of a place, the kind of thing that doesn't fade with time. It just waits. It waits for someone new to arrive, someone who doesn't know the rules, someone who doesn't believe the stories. In the winter of 1929, that someone was coming, and Greylock was ready for them. The house on the hill was about to have visitors, and it had been a very, very long time. To understand what happened that winter, you have to go back. Way back. To the archives. We spent weeks in the dusty basement of the Rappahannock County Courthouse, poring over old property deeds, tax records, and brittle yellowed newspapers. And that's where we found him. Gregory Greylock, the man who built the estate in the late 1880s. The records showed a man of considerable wealth, but very little connection to the local community. He was an outsider, from a big city up north, Philadelphia we think. He bought the land, built the house, and then, it seems, he simply disappeared behind its stone walls. A mystery from the very beginning. The official story, the one written in the county ledger, was straightforward. Gregory Greylock was a recluse, a man who preferred the company of his books to the company of people. The deed, dated 1887, described the purchase of the land in meticulous detail. Tax records from the following years showed payments made on time, every time, by a law firm in Richmond. But there were no records of him ever coming into town. No store receipts, no church attendance. It was as if he existed only on paper, as if the man himself was a ghost long before he actually became one. The house was his world, and he didn't seem to want anyone else in it. But then, we found something else, tucked away in a box of unfiled correspondence. A series of letters from the county sheriff in 1912. He was writing to a distant relative of Greylock's, a cousin in Baltimore. The sheriff expressed concern. He mentioned that no one had seen Mr. Greylock for months. The mail was piling up. The grounds were falling into disrepair. He wrote about a pervading sense of unease among the few farmhands who lived on the edge of the property. It was a different story from the official one. A story with shadows. A story that hinted that something was very wrong at the house on the hill. The final piece of the archival puzzle was a brief, two-sentence notice in the local paper from the spring of 1913. It stated that Gregory Greylock had passed away from natural causes. He was found in his study. Case closed. But was it? The sheriff's letter suggested a deeper concern, a mystery left unsolved. The archives gave us the bones of the story, the official version. But the whispers we heard from the old-timers in town, they told a different tale. They said the house itself was the cause. That Gregory Greylock hadn't just died. He had been consumed by the very place he had built. Then came the winter of 1929, and with it, new life. Or so they hoped. The stock market had crashed just a few months earlier, sending ripples of panic across the nation. For a group of young, optimistic friends from Richmond, the chaos was a chance for a new beginning. Away from the city's anxieties, Jasper Whitmore was the leader. A handsome, charismatic, aspiring writer, full of dreams and grand ideas. He saw Greylock Estate not as a crumbling relic, but as a grand adventure, a place to create, a sanctuary. He had just inherited a small sum of money, enough to lease the long-abandoned property for a song. He couldn't believe his luck. With him was his younger sister, Opal. She was practical, sensible, the anchor to Jasper's high-flying kite. She was a talented artist, hoping the quiet and natural beauty of the countryside would inspire her work. She had her reservations about the isolated house, sure, but her loyalty to her brother was absolute. If Jasper believed in this place, she would too. They were joined by two of their closest friends. A boisterous, cheerful young man named Thomas, who was handy with a hammer and saw, and a quiet, thoughtful woman named Clara, a musician who brought her cello, hoping the acoustics of the old house would be just right. Their motivation was simple. It was the eternal dream of youth, to escape the confines of the old world and build a new one of their own. A commune of artists, you might call it. They pictured roaring fires in the massive stone fireplaces, evenings filled with music and poetry, and days spent exploring the vast, untamed land. They packed up their belongings in a sputtering Ford Model A, full of excitement and hope. They were blissfully unaware of the stories that clung to Greylock like the ivy on its walls. To them, it was a blank canvas, an empty stage waiting for their story to unfold. They arrived on a cold, gray afternoon in late November. The house loomed larger and more imposing than they had imagined. The air was crisp and cold, but their spirits were high. They saw the overgrown gardens as a project, the dusty rooms as a challenge. They were pioneers, ready to tame this forgotten corner of the world. They had no idea that the house had its own plans, that the silence they craved was not empty. It was full of echoes, echoes of the man who had come before them. And the house was not a blank canvas. It was a story already written, and they had just walked into the final chapter. Their first trip into the nearby town of Sperryville should have been a warning. It was a small, tight-knit community where, honestly, everyone knew everyone else's business. And, well, the arrival of the 4 young city dwellers at Greylock was the biggest news in years. When Jasper and Thomas walked into the general store for supplies, the cheerful chatter suddenly stopped. All eyes turned to them. The storekeeper, a stern-faced man named Mr. Abernathy, looked at them not with curiosity, but with something else. Pity? Or maybe it was suspicion. The welcome was as cold as the winter air outside. Every question was met with a short, clipped answer. Jasper, ever the charmer, tried to make conversation. He asked about the history of their new home. "We leased the old Greylock place," he announced proudly. A hush fell over the store. Mr. Abernathy just polished the counter with a rag, his eyes downcast. "Not much to tell," he mumbled. "Been empty a long time." Another man, sitting by the pot-bellied stove, chimed in. "Empty for a reason," he said, his voice low. He didn't elaborate, he just stared into the fire. The message was clear. This was a subject they did not wish to discuss, especially not with the outsiders who had just moved in. Opal and Clara had a similar experience when they tried to speak with some local women near the post office. They asked for advice on gardening, on handling the harsh Virginia winters. The women were polite but distant. Their smiles never quite reached their eyes. When Opal mentioned the name Greylock, one of the women made a small sign of the cross over her chest. She quickly disguised the gesture as brushing something off her coat, but Opal saw it. It was a fleeting moment, but it sent a chill down her spine. It was a clear signal, a wall of silence. The town was keeping them at arm's length. They drove back to the estate that evening, feeling confused, a little hurt. They had expected a warm country welcome. Instead, they got the cold shoulder. They laughed it off, blaming it on small-town suspicion of city folk. They were young. They were confident. They didn't understand that the town's silence wasn't meant to be rude. It was a warning. A warning they were too naive to understand. The locals knew the stories. They had grown up with them. They knew that Greylock was a place to be left alone. And they believed that anyone who ignored that wisdom was simply courting disaster. The silence was their way of saying, "You're on your own." So who was this man, Gregory Greylock? The one whose name could silence a room. The official report said he died of natural causes in his study. A lonely recluse who simply passed away. But when we spoke to Hazel Abernathy, the 92-year-old granddaughter of the storekeeper Jasper met, she told us a different story. A story she heard from her father, who was a young deputy back in 1913. "Natural causes," she said with a dry laugh. "That's what the sheriff put in his report. But that's not what my daddy saw. He was one of the first ones in the house. He said it was the coldest place he'd ever been, and it was a spring day." According to Hazel, her father's testimony painted a much stranger picture. He said Gregory Greylock was found in his leather armchair, a book open on his lap, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the far wall, and his face was frozen in an expression of pure, abject terror, as if he had seen something unimaginable in his final moments. The doctor who signed the death certificate was old and in a hurry. He chalked it up to a heart attack, a sudden shock. But the deputy, Hazel's father, he never bought it. He said there was no sign of a break-in, nothing was stolen. But the room was in disarray. Books had been pulled from the shelves, strewn across the floor. Not all of them, just specific ones. And the windows were all locked from the inside, the doors bolted. It was as if a tornado had torn through that single room, while the rest of the house was pristine, untouched, covered in a thin layer of dust. The deputy told his son, Hazel's father, that the fireplace was swept clean, but the air held the distinct smell of burnt paper. A lot of burnt paper. What had Gregory Greylock been so desperate to destroy in his final hours? What had he been reading? And what had he seen that put that look on his face? Hazel told us another thing her father always mentioned, the book on Greylock's lap. It was a very old, leather-bound volume with no title on the cover, just a strange symbol embossed in gold. The deputy said he tried to pick it up, but the sheriff stopped him. "Leave it be," the sheriff had said. "Some things are better left alone." The book was never logged into evidence. It simply disappeared. The official story was neat and tidy. The reality, as passed down through the generations, was messy and terrifying. A man, locked in a room, dies of fright. It was a story that didn't make sense, and it was the story the Whitmores had just moved into. In the beginning, their letters home were filled with joy. We found a collection of them in an old trunk belonging to Opal's cousin. The first few, written by Jasper in early December, were practically glowing. "The air here is a tonic," he wrote. "We are pioneers in our own private kingdom. The work is hard, but our spirits are higher than the mountains. Opal is sketching constantly, and Clara's cello has never sounded so beautiful. This house, it is a muse." He described their days spent clearing rooms, making repairs, and their nights spent reading by the fire. It was the idyll they had dreamed of. A perfect escape. Opal's letters from that first week were just as hopeful, but with a slight, almost imperceptible undertone of unease. She wrote about the beauty of the frost on the window panes and the silence of the snow-covered woods. But she also mentioned things. Small things. "It's a very old house," she wrote to her aunt. "It makes so many noises. The floors creak, the wind howls in the chimney. Thomas says it's just the house settling, but sometimes it sounds like footsteps in the hall upstairs, when we are all downstairs." She dismissed it as her imagination. A city girl, not yet used to the country quiet. But as December wore on, the tone of the letters began to change. The bright optimism started to fade, replaced by a creeping anxiety. Jasper's writing became less about the beauty of the place and more about the challenges. "The cold is relentless," he wrote. "We can't seem to keep the house warm. There's a draft we can't find. It seems to follow us from room to room." He mentioned that Thomas was growing irritable, and Clara had stopped playing her cello. She said the acoustics were wrong. The notes sounded sad, she claimed. The dream was beginning to fray at the edges. The sanctuary was starting to feel like a prison. The last letter we have from Opal, dated January 19, 1929, just 4 days before we believe the story reached its climax, is chilling. Her handwriting, usually so neat and precise, was shaky, hurried. "Something is wrong here," she wrote. "It's not just the cold. There's a feeling in this house, a watchfulness. Jasper tries to laugh it off, but I see the fear in his eyes. The books in the library, some of them are missing. the ones about local history and folklore. And there are rooms that we cannot get into. The doors are locked and we can't find the keys. We keep hearing noises at night. Not the house settling. Something else. I am so afraid. What were those noises? What happened in those final days? The letters stop there. But the story doesn't. Hazel Abernathy, the keeper of the town's memory, filled in the blanks. She said her father, the deputy, was called out to the estate again. This time, in the dead of winter, on January 23, 1929. A farmer who lived down the road had seen that the Model A was packed, as if for a hasty departure. But it hadn't moved in 2 days. The house was dark, silent. When the deputy and the sheriff arrived, they found the front door unlocked, swinging gently in the wind. The house was empty, and colder than ever. The scene inside was one of quiet chaos. It was clear they had left in a hurry. A half-eaten meal was on the kitchen table, frozen solid. Opal's art supplies were scattered on the floor of her room, a charcoal sketch of a terrified face left on her easel. In the main hall, a large, heavy bookcase had been pulled down, blocking the doorway to the library. It was a desperate, panicked barricade. But what were they trying to keep in? Or out? Of the 4 friends, there was no sign. They were gone. All their belongings, their car, everything was left behind. They had vanished into thin air. The official investigation was short. The sheriff concluded that the city folk, unaccustomed to the harsh winter and the isolation, had simply packed up and left on foot. Maybe they walked to the next county to catch a train. It was a thin theory, but it was the one that stuck. It was easier than confronting the alternative. But the townspeople knew better. They remembered the look on Gregory Greylock's face. They remembered the stories. They said the house had taken them, just as it had taken its first owner. The missing library books, the locked rooms, the nocturnal disturbances. It all fit the pattern of a house that doesn't like visitors. And so, the Greylock mystery became another layer of the local lore. A ghost story told to scare children, but one that adults secretly believed. It's a story about how some places hold on to the past. They remember. The house on the hill, it remembers Gregory Greylock's terror, and it remembers the hopeful faces of Jasper, Opal, Thomas, and Clara. Their story is a chilling reminder. A reminder that some secrets don't want to be unveiled. Some doors are locked for a reason. And sometimes the whispers of a small town hold more truth than any official report ever could. The house is still there, on its hill, waiting, remembering.